The 1950s and 60s are often
In the early 1970s, hijackings of flights originating from the U.S. were, quite literally, out of control. When the U.S. government passed the Anti-Hijacking Act of 1974, it was a direct response to what is now sometimes called the golden age of skyjackings. In fact, between 1960 and 1974, there were 240 hijackings, or attempted hijackings, between the US and Cuba alone. So, today we're going to take a look at the golden age of plane hijackings. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel and let us know in the comments below what other aviation-related topics you would like to hear about. Now, if you look at the center of your screen, you'll notice this Weird History explainer video. On May 1st, 1961, Antuilio Ramirez Ortez took over the cockpit of a National Airlines flight on its way to Key West, Florida. He had a gun and a knife, and he demanded to be taken to Cuba so he could warn Fidel Castro of an assassination plot against him. Ortez said he was a Castro loyalist who left Cuba looking for work but now wanted to return to his native land. When the plane arrived in Cuba, Castro returned it, the crew, and the other passengers within a day. Ortez stayed in Cuba. 2 years later, Ortez tried to leave again. However, this time he was arrested, and in 1965 he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for espionage. When he got out of prison, he tried to leave yet again and wound up spending another 3 years in prison in the early 1970s. He finally made it out of Cuba again in 1975. His triumph was short-lived, however, because he was immediately arrested for the 1961 hijacking upon arrival in the U.S. He spent 4 years in prison in the U.S. Although it's hard to believe now, at the time of Ortez's hijacking, the U.S. had no official policies regarding air piracy. So instead, he was charged with assault and transporting a stolen aircraft across state lines. The late 1960s and early 1970s were characterized by an epidemic of hijackings, and most of the planes were taken in the U.S. and then redirected to Cuba. The reasons for these hijackings varied widely, with the perpetrators wanting everything from being able to study communism to getting some decent frijoles. That's not a bad joke. Seriously, a guy hijacked an airplane for frijoles. Hijacking for pizza, yeah, I get. Frijoles, that's more of jaywalking. The U.S. Congress decided to take action and, as a result of Senate hearings, the Federal Aviation Administration set up a task force to explore counter-hijacking techniques. Previously, pilots had been given guns, but obviously that wasn't too effective. Now, operating under the theory that the best offense would be a good defense, the government mandated that airline passengers were to be sent through metal detectors. Additionally, the first hijacker profile was established. If there's one thing the world has learned from social media and internet comments, it's that everyone thinks they're an expert on everything. So when hijackings became a problem and the FAA decided they wanted to take action, you can bet your house the average airline passenger had a few ideas on what should be done, and they weren't afraid to say so. Passengers, understandably, wanted to protect themselves, so they chimed in and offered suggestions ranging from cartoonishly impractical booby traps to screening processes rooted in bigoted paranoia. Some of the more memorable examples of passenger suggestions included installing trapdoors outside cockpits, arming stewardesses with tranquilizer darts, and playing the Cuban national anthem before takeoff, and then arresting anyone who knew the lyrics. Lucky for everyone, the FAA decided to listen to the experts. Although it may not be the most exciting or gratifying strategy, simply giving in to an armed skyjacker's demands was the safest, most practical option for airline pilots. So that's what they were told to do. Cockpits were equipped with maps of the Caribbean. Pilots were told about the landing facilities at Havana's Jose Marti International Airport, and they were given cards with rudimentary Spanish so they could communicate with any potential hijacker. An official Cuba hijack phone line was installed at Miami Air Traffic Control, and the Swiss, who were the U.S.'s diplomatic intermediaries, created a form that could be used to request the return of planes. Castro, for his part, was really more interested in embarrassing the U.S. than anything else, so most of the planes were eventually returned, albeit with a heavy fee attached. Rafael Minichiello skyjacked a flight in October of 1969, one that had several stop-offs before reaching its final destination. He flew from Los Angeles to San Francisco, where he hijacked a plane and demanded to be taken to New York. That guy's racking up the miles. The plane stopped in Denver, and the passengers were released. After refueling in New York, FBI agents tried to keep Minichiello from taking off again. Born in Italy, Minichiello wanted to go home, and after firing his gun, was allowed to continue on a flight to Rome. He escaped capture when he landed in Rome, but was later tracked down by police and taken into custody. Italy refused to extradite him and tried him in Rome instead. His actions woke up FAA and FBI officials as well as hijackers to the possibility of taking flights to a location other than Cuba, which was something they had never really considered for no reason other than it had almost never come up before. So why was Minichiello so mad? What drove him to do it? Well, he said he was shorted $200 in one of his paychecks as a US Marine. You guys, don't rip off a Marine. Most of the planes hijacked in the late 1960s and early 1970s were relatively small, carrying about 100 passengers on average. In 1973, however, when a hijacker identified as R. Campos commandeered American Airlines Flight 299 from New York to San Juan, he took a plane with 379 passengers on board to Cuba. The plane landed safely in Cuba and was greeted by Fidel Castro himself. Castro chatted with the pilot, Captain Augustus Watkins, and inspected the 747 while assuring him that the plane would be able to take off, despite its size and a lack of appropriate runway space at the Cuban airport. What can't Castro do? The plane did take off shortly after landing and made its way to Miami. After FBI agents debriefed Watkins, the 747 departed for San Juan, arriving only about 7 hours late. Most all hijackers up until this point had been men, but not all hijackers are men. Take Catherine Marie Kirkow, who along with fellow Black Panther Roger Holder, hijacked Western Airlines Flight 701 from Los Angeles to Seattle by claiming to have a bomb. They demanded $500,000 and let the plane land in San Francisco. Once on the ground, Kirkow and her colleague boarded a plane to Algeria, where they were granted asylum. Not cool, Algeria. She was charged with air piracy by a federal court in 1972, and a warrant was issued for her arrest. In 1975, the two were arrested for trying to illegally enter France. They were found guilty and fined, and they were released but not allowed to leave Paris. Kirkow, however, left. Holder was extradited to the US, but Kirkow's whereabouts are unknown. She remains on the most wanted list for domestic terrorism. After hijacking a Pan-American flight headed to Puerto Rico in 1968, Luis Armando Pena Soltran spent over 40 years in Cuba. According to accounts, Soltran and two accomplices stormed the cockpit with weapons he snuck on the flight in a diaper bag. His fellow hijackers were arrested and sent back to prison in the U.S., but Soltran was protected, and he had a long tenure as a fugitive in Cuba before returning to the U.S. in 2009. However, the U.S. doesn't forget hijackers, and upon his return in 2011, he faced air piracy and kidnapping charges and was sentenced to 15 years in prison. In 1972, 3 criminals hijacked a plane in Birmingham, Alabama, shortly after it took off. They ordered the pilot to fly around the country for a while and demanded a $10 million ransom. At one point, they even threatened to have the plane crash into the nuclear facility at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Despite the bluster, however, the affair eventually ended, thankfully, without a nuclear explosion. But the incident wasn't completely bloodless either. The first officer was shot, and 31 passengers were held hostage for 29 hours. In 1974, Samuel Bike hijacked a Delta Airlines flight leaving Baltimore, Maryland, and he had big plans. Namely, to crash the plane into the White House. Bike had a gun and a bomb on board. When he got to the cockpit of the plane, he shot both the co-pilot and the pilot, killing the first and injuring the latter. Thanks to the unsmart thinking of taking out the pilot, Bike never got the plane off of the ground. Then a police officer pursued him, who shot him while he was still in the plane. Accounts vary as to whether or not the cop killed Bike or merely wounded him before Bike took his own life. Bike didn't get to carry his plan out, but he did leave his mark on pop culture. He's a character in Stephen Sondheim's and John Wiedeman's 1991 musical Assassins, and he was portrayed by Sean Penn in the 2004 film The Assassination of Richard Nixon. He's even alleged to be one of the inspirations for the character Travis Bickle, who was played by Robert De Niro in the 1976 hit film Taxi Driver. Possibly the most famous jacker of all time was the enigmatic Dan Cooper, who, through a mistake propagated by the mass media, became known to the world as D.B. Cooper. Cooper, whoever he may have been, famously hijacked a Northwest Airlines flight in 1971 over Washington state. After the flight landed in Seattle, authorities delivered him $200,000, as well as several parachutes. He demanded to be taken to Mexico, and the plane took off again. While heading south, Cooper parachuted out of the plane, never to be seen again. While the FBI believes Cooper likely couldn't have survived his jump given the weather conditions and gear he was wearing, there are, nonetheless, lots of theories about what happened to him. There have been no traces of Cooper himself since the hijacking. However, in 1980, 3 packets of Cooper's ransom money were discovered in a sandy riverbank of the Columbia River. And in 2017, authorities found what they thought was a strap from his parachute in the Pacific Northwest. As the 1970s wore on, airplane hijackings became more brazen, more global, and more extortionist. Threatening passengers' lives for money and then using the planes to escape were the preferred methods of skyjacking. To end the situation once and for all, the FBI began sending snipers to tarmacs, and plainclothes agents began boarding planes. Finally, on January 5, 1973, all passengers began being screened. While this didn't put an end to hijackings, it did put an end to the frequent occurrences that constituted the golden age of hijackings. So what do you think? Do you feel safe on airplanes in modern times? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.